And continuing with the 6th chapter of Silver on the Tree, The Bearded Lake. I'm kind of breaking here at all of the breaks in the narrative that are on the page. Jane has let her brothers know kind of how she's feeling about Bran, and Barney has told her that he thinks, it may be the dark manipulating her and that she needs to fight it off. Bran said as they watched Barney and Jane running toward them up the path. What was all that about, do you think? They could just have been discussing whether it was time for lunch, Will said. Bran pulled his glasses down his nose. The tawny eyes regarded Will steadily for a moment between the dark lenses and cap. Old one, Bran said softly. You know better than that. Then he pushed his glasses back and grinned. Anyway, it's too early. But Will looked soberly down at the approaching figures. The light needs those three, it always has. In this whole long quest, so the dark must be watching them very hard now. We must stay close to them, Bran, especially Barney, perhaps. Barney came panting up to them, his hood flapping on his shoulders and his yellow hair damp dark with rain. When's lunch? He said. Bran laughed. Cam March Arthur is just over the next slope. What does it look like? Without waiting for an answer, Barney was gone. Trotting up the path, Mackintosh flapping, Bran turned to go after him, but Jane was in his way. She stood there, breathing unevenly, looking coolly at them both, in a way Will did not recognize. It won't do, she said. We're all marching along as if everything was ordinary, but we can't go on pretending to one another. Will looked at her, patience battling urgency in his mind. His head dropped for a moment on his chest, and he let out a short hiss of breath. All right, then. What do you want us to say? Just something about what we might find up there, Jane said, quavering, exasperated. About what we're doing here? Bran was on the words like a terrier on a bone before Will could open his mouth. Doing? Nothing, girl. You'll probably have nothing to do but look at a valley and a lake and say, oh, how pretty, what's the fuss? If you don't like the rain, wrap yourself up and go home. Go on. Bran! Will said sharply. Jane stood very still, eyes wide. Bran said angrily, The hell with it. If you have seen the rising of fear, and the killing of love, and the dark creeping over all things, you do not ask stupid questions. You do what you are intended to do and no nonsense. And so that is what we should all be doing now, going on where we might perhaps find the next right move. And no nonsense, said Jane tightly. Simon came up behind her, silent, listening, but she paid no attention. Right, Bran snapped. Watching Jane, Will felt suddenly that he was seeing something he had never met, that he was seeing someone he had never met before. Her face was drawn into furious lines of emotion that seemed to belong to someone else. You, Jane said to Bran, pushing her hands fiercely into her pockets. You think you're so special, don't you, with the white hair and the difference and the eyes behind those silly glasses. Super different. You can tell us what we ought to do. You think you're even more special than Will, but who are you anyway? We never met you at all until yesterday in the middle of nowhere on a mountain. Why should we get into danger just because you... Her voice quivered and dwindled, and she swung away from them up the hill toward Barney's small, eager, vanishing form. Simon began to go after her, and then paused irresolute. Special, is it? Bran said softly to himself. Special, that's nice. After all the years of people sneering and muttering about the boy with no color in his creepy skin, that's special. That's lovely, special. And what is it about the eyes? Yes, Will said shortly. Special, you know it. Bran hesitated. He pulled off his glasses and stuffed them into his pocket. That is separate, and she knows nothing of it. And that is not what she meant. No, Will said. But you and I must not forget it for a moment. And you may not. Let go like that. I know, Bran said. I'm sorry. He looked desperately at Simon as he spoke, including him in the apology. Simon said awkwardly, I don't know what all this is about, but you shouldn't be bothered by Jane flying off the handle. It doesn't mean anything. Doesn't seem like her, said Will. Well, now and then she does it these days. A sort of flare-up, I think, Simon said confidingly. She's going through a stage. Maybe, Will said. He was looking at Bran. Or maybe it is Jane we should be specially watching. Come on, Bran said. He brushed raindrops from the brim of his cap. Can't much, Arthur. They climbed on to the line where the green grass slope met a grey sky. On the downward sweep of the path on the other side, Jane and Barney were crouched beside a small outcropping of rock, identical with every other rocky scar on the hill, but singled out by a neat slate marker with a label. Will came slowly down the path, his senses open and alert as the ears of a hunting dog, but he felt nothing. Glancing across, he saw the same blankness on Bran's face. There's a sort of carved-out circle here that's supposed to be where the hoof of Arthur's horse trod. Look, it's marked. Barney measured the hollow in the rock with his hand. And another over there. He sniffed, unimpressed. Pretty small horse. They are hoof-shaped, though, Jane said. Her head was down, her voice slightly husky. I wonder what really made them. Erosion, Simon said. Water swirling around. With dirt rubbing, Bran said. Jane said hesitantly, and frost cracking the rock. Or the hoof of a magic horse coming down hard, Barney said. He looked at Will. Only it wasn't, was it? No, Will said, smiling. Hardly. If Arthur had ridden over every hollow, called Arthur's hoofprint, or sat down on every rock, called Arthur's seat, or drunk from every spring, called Arthur's well, he'd have spent a whole life travelling round Britain without a stop. And so would the knights, said Barney cheerfully. To sit around every hill called King Arthur's Round Table. Yes, Will said. He picked up a small white quartz pebble and rolled it round and round in his palm. Those too, some of the names mean other things. Barney jumped. Where's the lake? The one he's supposed to have taken the monster from? Luin Barfog, Bran said. The bearded lake, over here. He led them on down the path into a hollow between hilltops. Curving round a slope, the rain, which had been gentle, began here to whip at their faces in uneven gusts as the high wind eddied round the gullied land. The cloud was low over their heads. Such a funny name, the Bearded Lake, Jane said. The words were aimed at Bran. Though she walked without looking at him, Will felt a pang of compassion for her groping, unspoken apology. Bearded? Not exactly romantic. I'll show you why in a minute, Bran said without rancor. Watch where you tread now, there's boggy patches. He strode ahead of them all, dodging tussocks of reedy grass that marked wet ground. And then Will looked up, and suddenly, there ahead of him, through the driving rain, he could see the far side of the Happy Valley again. Misted and gray, but this time, on this side, on their own steep edge overhanging the valley, there lay a lake. It was a strange, small, reed-edged lake, little larger than a pond. Its dark surface seemed curiously patched and patterned. Then Will saw that its open surface was rippled by the wind. But that only a small part of it was open, a triangle at the closest end of the lake. All the rest of its surface, from the end at the edge to the valley to a trailing V shape in the center, was covered with the leaves and stems and creamy white blossom of water lilies. And from a singing in his ears like the sudden rise of waves on a loud sea, he knew that too, somewhere up here after all, was the place to which they were intended to come. Something waited for them here, something up on this rolling rock-strewn mountaintop between the Happy Valley and the estuary of the Dovey River. Through a mist that was not the rain in the air but a blurring inside his mind, he saw with a vague distant surprise that this feeling did not seem to have come to Bran. The white-haired boy stood on the path where Simon and Jane, one hand raised over his eyes against the wind and rain, the others pointing. The Bearded Lake. See, it's the weed on the water that gives it the name. Some years, when there is not much rain, it gets much smaller, and the weed is left all around it like a beard. John Rowland says perhaps the name is not from that, Perhaps long ago there was much more water in the lake, and it would spill out over the edge of the mountain, and then down into the valley like a waterfall. That could be too, but a long time ago indeed, the way it looks now. The little lake lay dark and silent under the shifting gray sky. They could hear the wind whining over the hills, the rustling through their clothes. Down in the valley far away, a curlew gave its sad ghostly call. Then, closer by somewhere, they heard a muffled shout. Barney turned his head. "What's that?" Bran looked across the lake at the slope that seemed to be the highest point of the mountain on which they stood. He sighed. "Visitors shouting for the echo. Come and see." Will lagged behind as they balanced their way, one after the other, along the muddy rock-strewn path edging the lake. He gazed out once more across the water and its white, starred green carpet of weed, to the far shore, where the land fell abruptly away into the valley. The rain blew back into his eyes, the mist whirled over their heads, but nothing came into his consciousness. Nothing spoke to him. There was only the strong sense pulsing through his mind that they were in the presence of the high magic in some form he did not understand. So then Will followed the others along the path and round the next high slope. He found them standing on a bluff overlooking a flat hollow in the hills, perhaps 50 yards square, a space much like the one occupied by the bearded lake, but here holding only the bright patches of coarse, reedy grass that warmed the marsh. A man and woman wearing startling orange anoraks stood lower down the slope, with 3 children of assorted sizes roaming about them, shouting across the flat green hollow. A steep cliff-like rock on the opposite side threw the echo back. "Hey! Hey! Ooh! Ooh! Ba-ba, black sheep! Black sheep! Sheep! Hey, fat face! Face! Face!" Jane said. "If you listen carefully, it's really a double echo, the second very faint." "Fat face!" shouted the most raucous of the children again, delighted with himself. Barney said in a clear, precise voice, "Funny how people can never think of anything intelligent to shout to make an echo." "It's like never knowing what to say to find out if a microphone's working," Will said. Testing, 1, 2, 3. "The English master at school has a very rude rhyme he uses for that," Simon said. "You can't shout rude rhymes for an echo," Barney said coldly. "Echoes are special. People ought to sing to them." "Sing!" said Jane. The small children were still screeching at the mountain. She looked at them with distaste. "Well, why not? I'll do some Shakespeare. Simon was Prospero last term. Why not a bit of that?" "Were you really?" Bran looked at Simon with new interest. "Only because I was the tallest," Simon said deprecatingly, "and had the right kind of voice." "Fat face!" shouted all the awful children together. "Oh, really?" said Jane, losing patience. "What's the matter with their stupid parents?" She swung around irritably and walked a little way back down the slope. The wind seemed less gusty here. The rain had calmed to a fine mist. Underbrush scratched at her ankles. The slope was thick with heather and low-growing bilberry bushes, studded here and there with tiny blue blackberries among the leaves. The others' voices receded as she wandered away. She thrust her hands deep into her pockets and hunched her shoulders, as if to shake something from her back. "Black dog on my shoulder," she thought wryly. It was the family term for a brief bad mood, generally her own these days, yet somehow this time Jane felt there was more than a mood invading her mind. This was a strangeness she could not define, had never known before. A restless, half-fearful anticipation of something. Part of her seemed to understand, and part of her, Jane sighed. It was like being 2 people at once, living with someone without having the least idea what the other would do or feel next. And we will pause there.